hearing this week. I didn't think it got a lot of play on CNN or MSNBC or really, frankly, barely anywhere. This was a Senate hearing with the top scientists in America, from our top universities in America. And shockingly, it didn't seem like any of them agreed with our experts that are running the show in America. In fact, if you listen to it, it sounds like they think that these draconian measures are putting us in harm's way. Here's the Senate hearing you probably did not see.
The goal of the strict isolation has been accomplished. We need to stop underemphasizing the actual empirical data and establish medical science while instead somehow doubling down on hypothetical models. Science and logic must prevail over fear in worst-case scenarios.
One-size-fits-all lockdowns are not based on actual evidence or science regarding COVID-19, but are instead based on fear and off-the-shelf playbooks.
While lockdowns were justified initially, their perpetuation may risk many lives. While treatment advances and vaccine efforts may be successful eventually, lockdown measures cannot be prolonged until we find treatments and vaccines.
If we're ever going to get our lives back and not be on the indefinite timeline of maybe there will be a highly effective vaccine mass produced, we actually need the virus to circulate among people who can safely get it, get over it, make antibodies, which historically, before the advent of highly effective vaccines, was how pandemics ended.
It is not logical that younger age groups must somehow be isolated or maintain a 6-foot spacing from each other. If infection in low-risk groups is still prevalent, which it is, socializing represents the opportunity for developing the widespread immunity, eradicating the threat to the vulnerable.
The problem with an interdiction strategy that starts and ends with flattening the curve is you can never stop. Everybody's been kept away from the virus. Everybody's been sheltering in place. Nobody has immunity. And so if there's any level of viral circulation, asymptomatic carriers, for example, everyone remains vulnerable. The minute you release those clamps, you get the spike you thought you had prevented.
This total isolation policy prevents broad population immunity. We know from decades of medical science that the population develops immunity while acquiring antibodies.
You have to allow the virus to circulate and those who can safely get through it to develop herd immunity. But that's the problem with flattening the curve. Absolutely a critical tactic to avoid overwhelming a medical system at a given place in a given time, but it really can only be phase one of a multi-phase plan.
Hundreds of thousands of people have serious diseases that are not being treated. Transplants from living donors are down 85% from last year. In the U.S. alone, 150,000 new cancer cases arise every single month. These patients are not being seen.
Deaths from common chronic diseases and treatable conditions, such as heart attacks, may increase as patients avoid hospitals from fear, as interaction with their caregivers is disrupted.
30 million Americans have lost their jobs, and that the CBO estimates that second quarter GDP will be 40% lower than it was at this time last year.
Unemployment may create more marginalized citizens without health insurance. Mental health can be affected with increases in depression, suicides, domestic violence, and child abuse.
Food insecurity hurts people, desperation hurts people, depression, addiction. We've seen spikes in everything from gun sales to domestic violence to suicides since the advent of this pandemic.
And contact tracing, although an important part of the overall preparation for potential future outbreaks, is not critical right now and is not as valuable after a disease is already widespread, infecting tens of millions of people.
It is unrealistic to expect that complete contact tracing will need to be feasible before reopening, where you have 30% of New York already infected at the moment, or 5% in other states, or 10% when you have a sizable portion of the population already infected. They have been exposing almost everyone else.
There's an alternative to contact tracing, and that is to say we identify people at higher risk and we carefully protect them from exposure to the virus. And people at low risk, we actually expect the virus to circulate. So contact tracing in that group almost defeats the purpose.
Treating COVID-19 at all costs is severely restricting other medical care and instilling fear in the public, creating a massive health disaster.
Does anyone else out there wish you could vote on